The group of 20 leaders have all reached Indonesia. Preparations are ongoing as we speak for the key summit here. Let's first take a look at the agenda. Food and energy security, it's become a top priority. It's a fallout of the war in Ukraine and also because of the declining world economy. Countries that are not remotely involved in the war, they're also facing the brunt. The July agreement to get Ukrainian grain moving again was a breakthrough. It helped poorer nations cope with food shortage around the world. Last month, it hit a hiccup when Putin briefly walked away from this agreement. Even though the plan is now up and running, Western leaders will try to put in place a mechanism for future roadblocks. The COVID-19 pandemic was way up in the cards still last year, but the focus has now shifted to the post-COVID phase. World leaders are gathering to shape the new world. The virus has not stopped to exist. It still exists, but countries seem ready to move to the next level here. Now, for more on this, we're now being joined by Dr. Robert Edwin Kelly from Busan, South Korea. Kelly is an American political analyst on inter-Korean affairs and a professor of political science at the Busan National University. Thank you so much for joining us on this broadcast.
Thank you for having me.
Now, what would you say is at stake here for Asian economies, especially when it comes to food, energy security and defense capabilities?
Yeah, I think that's probably the primary is particularly food and energy, right? We know those costs have spiked, and we know that a lot of Asian countries import food, and particularly they import energy, right? Which is one of the reasons why a lot of Asian countries have been very mixed in response to the Cold War, or the Ukraine war. I don't think there's much sympathy for Russian behavior. It really is sort of, I think, more driven by economics. To my sense is that the G20 has not really managed to resolve that issue. I mean, ultimately, this is really still a battlefield issue between the Ukrainians and the Russians. Both sides still think they can win, and there's just limited leverage that the Chinese and the Americans have to sort of push the two parties towards some kind of resolution. I would imagine the war will drag on for at least another year, and it will continue to create these sort of side effects. And there's only so much the G20 can do about that, because, I mean, none of us really have the ability to force the Russians and the Ukrainians to negotiate. So this will be going with us for a while.
Right, absolutely. That being said, now we have seen a period of heightened tensions between North and the South, also simmering tensions in the Taiwan Strait. What is your assessment of the security situation in the region?
I think it's actually more stable than you would imagine from sort of the journalistic coverage of the last 9 months or so. I mean, when we see these kinds of tests and stuff like that, it gets a lot of coverage, and it's important. But it's important also to notice that North Korea really doesn't want a conflict with South Korea. These weapons are built primarily for defense, and that a Chinese move against Taiwan would be extraordinarily dangerous and difficult to do. It's not clear to me that China, for example, could actually take Taiwan without destroying it, which would sort of defeat the point of doing so. It would also provoke a major American intervention, which would be against China's interest, because China actually benefits from the global trade order. So I'm actually a little bit more optimistic about the East Asian order. I actually think that Korea is less of a hotspot than I think all the missile tests suggest. And I think the Chinese will be much more cautious on Taiwan, particularly now that we've seen the Russians flounder so badly in Ukraine. Right? If the Russians were able to snatch Ukraine in a couple days and present that as a fait accompli to the world, I think that might have encouraged Chinese aggression, but it's really gone the other way. And so I think the Chinese are probably a bit more hesitant.
All right. Well, what are some of the other key focus areas in this G20 summit? What sort of resolutions, if any, can we expect coming out of this?
Yeah, I actually think that the G20 probably won't bring too many resolutions, quite honestly. I'm somewhat pessimistic on that, primarily because I think the Americans and the Chinese, the two most important countries there, have begun to seriously drift apart on a lot of these issues. I do not believe that conflict is imminent, for example, over Taiwan, but I think the U.S. and the Chinese are pretty far apart. And again, a lot of that is because of the Ukraine war, which is driving them to separate sides. And so that gets made it difficult. The strategic issues have made it difficult actually to get to economic cooperation between the two, which is unfortunate, because there are actually many issues sort of below the core strategic issues of like nuclear weapons and Taiwan. There are many issues below that, like trade and finance, North Korea, climate change, where I think the United States and China actually have a lot of interest, and if you could only sort of clinch a deal and make it easier, I think for many of the world economy issues you mentioned would be alleviated by that. But I think it's really, really difficult because at the strategic level now there's a stalemate between China and the U.S., and it's kind of sliding towards a Cold War, I think.
All right. Well, Dr. Kelly, thank you so much for joining us on this broadcast with your insights on this.
Thank you for having me.
Now, correspondent Susan Tehrani has sent us this report from Washington. Let's listen in.
The G20 meeting is well underway in Bali, Indonesia, overshadowed by the war in Ukraine and Western pressure to isolate Russia. 17 G20 members are represented by their head of government, including leaders of the group of 7 leading industrialized nations, as well as China's President Xi Jinping. With U.S. President Joe Biden's highly anticipated and highly publicized face-to-face meeting with his Chinese counterpart well out of the way, the White House says that the U.S. president plans to be, quote-unquote, unapologetic in expressing U.S. support for Ukraine. Joe Biden is also expected to talk about the war's impact on energy and food security. However, President Biden is facing challenges in U.S. efforts to squeeze Russia's funding source 8 months into Moscow's invasion of Ukraine. And while the U.S. president is expected to make clear that U.S. support for Ukraine will be uninterrupted, convincing other countries to stay the course may be a challenge. Susan Tehrani reporting from New York for WION World is One.
WION is now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.